Thanks, Andrew. Good evening. Well, tonight, Labor missing in action on border security after an illegal boat was on Australian soil for days before the Prime Minister found out, while Palestinians are granted visa after visa, with security checks taking as little as an hour. Paul Keating warns Joe Biden is too old to be president, and he slams Australia's high income tax rates. We'll talk about that a bit later. The Woolworths CEO falls on his sword after going woke on Australia Day. Is it now time that corporates will finally get the message that Aussies hate being told what to think? And as Andrew just mentioned, that shocking footage that you just saw on his program of a Jewish man being dragged off from last night's aggressive pro-Palestinian protest outside Melbourne City Hall. Well, the man who was targeted by police will join me for an exclusive interview, so don't miss that a bit later in the program. But first tonight, Albanese government ministers are staying silent on when they first learnt about the illegal boat arrival. After our revelations, the asylum seekers landed days before the Prime Minister told Australia. Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and Defence Minister Richard Marles are each refusing to say when they first learned that boats had reached our shores. These are the third boats to touch down on Australian soil in a decade. They bypassed the aerial surveillance and the border controls. And this is now the first time that Nauru has been opened in 9 years. Usually, boats have been intercepted at sea and turned back. It's part of the long-time coalition's successful turn-back policy. But as we reported on Monday evening, the asylum seekers in WA arrived days before Albanese claimed to have found out about them on Friday afternoon during a media conference.
I've been travelling in the car, so I haven't been advised about that.
So, as we spoke about on Monday night, there was widespread knowledge in defence circles of the illegal arrivals on Thursday, the day before the Prime Minister got a shock on that Friday afternoon media conference. And then, as Paige Taylor in The Australian reported, these boats may have arrived overnight on Monday. Well, my Sky News daytime colleague, Kieran Gilbert, asked the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, whether it was accurate that Defence found out about the boats on Thursday.
Sharri reported that she was told by a Defence source that Defence was aware of that boat arrival on Thursday of last week. Why was the Prime Minister only notified on Friday?
Oh, again, I'm not going to provide commentary about unnamed sources. I mean, what's important here is that we have responded to this moment expeditiously. I mean, those who came by boat and who were arrived in Australia are now in Nauru.
As you saw, the Defence Minister clearly avoiding answering just a simple question. So to clarify this, we asked Marles again today precisely when he found out about the boat arrival. Was it Thursday? And why hadn't he told the Prime Minister? No response. Andrew Giles also refused to answer when he'd found out about the boats. He directed us to Claire O'Neill. She had nothing to say either. Nothing. The only conclusion you can draw from this is that there's a reason they're not answering the question, which is that they or their departments likely did have earlier knowledge about the boat arrivals, but didn't inform the PM. And perhaps this was to avoid the heat of scrutiny during parliamentary question time last week. Coming as it did so soon after the release of 149 criminals onto our streets, the reality is that this is a government that looks like it's lost control of national security because it really doesn't believe at its heart in tough measures. Did Albanese and Giles and Claire O'Neill really not realise that Australians would be angry about the release of hundreds of criminals, including murderers and child sex offenders, onto our streets? And now, as you know, many of those released have been accused of reoffending. There have been some 27 alleged reoffences. You can't help but feel that Labor, under Albanese and Andrew Giles, and remember, Andrew Giles once represented the 433 asylum seekers from the Tampa case, Well, this government seems to have reverted to their radical left past. Labor has given up pretending to be tough on border security, or maybe it doesn't care about social cohesion. It worries more about politics and winning marginal seats in Western Sydney than the safety of Australians. The Australian newspaper's former editor-in-chief, Paul Kelly, made some very important points today in quite an extraordinary article where he held a mirror up to modern-day Australia. And he spoke about how a major ethical issue has arisen because a National Senator, Perrin Davey, had 2 glasses of wine in Parliament House, while across the nation a tide of anti-Semitism has relentlessly gathered pace, threatening Jewish families and businesses. Paul Kelly writes that the Labor Party that boasts about its morality is in denial about the global wave of anti-Semitism and its penetration into Australian society. He asks, what role is the great Australian Labor Party playing? Sadly, it has virtually no role. It is largely missing in action. Perhaps it has market research saying the public isn't worried about anti-Semitism or that Jews are only a tiny portion of the population. If so, he writes, this is about as dumb as the market research once suggesting the voice would be carried. And Paul Kelly says that Labor needs to understand one thing, that it has essentially left the Jewish community in Australia without cover during the most damaging and sustained outbreak of anti-Semitism since World War II. An outbreak that he says, and he's right, is only getting worse. Now, Woolworths CEO Brad Banducci has announced he's stepping down later this year as the supermarket faces allegations of price gouging.
I announced my intention to retire today in August of this financial year. It will be 8.5 years as CEO at that point, and as we go into our centenary year, it felt like the time was right to pass the baton to the next generation at Woolworths, and I'm delighted to say that the next CEO of Woolworths will be an internal appointment, Amanda Bardwell, as our Managing Director of WooliesX right now.
Now, the company and Brad Banducci says that succession planning has been in place for a while, since last year even. But it is peculiar timing because this announcement comes just days after a disastrous interview with the ABC where he had a disagreement over whether or not the ACCC's head was retired, and he nearly stormed off. Have a look.
Sorry, the former head of the Competition Commission says his words are that
retired,
we have...
by the way.
I don't think you would impugn his integrity and his understanding of competition law.
I'm just saying the world has got much more competitive.
He retired 18 months ago. He's not...
Okay, can we take that out? Is that okay? I mean, he is retired, but I shouldn't have said that, Angus. Are we going to leave it in there if we are?
Well, I mean, we're on the record. You said it. I mean, you know, let's move on. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm done, guys. You know, I do this with good intent. You know, I don't do this with bad intent.
Oh, that is a shocker of a media performance. This also comes after, as you know, Woolworths faced a fierce backlash when it banned the sale of Australia Day merchandise. It went woke, it engaged in a serious case of virtual signalling, and it didn't end well. The clear message is that people didn't want to shop there anymore. They don't want corporates telling them whether they can or can't celebrate Australia Day and what they should think. Well, to discuss this and some of the other top stories of the day, let's bring in the former president of the Victorian Liberal Party, Michael Kroger, and former Labor Cabinet Minister, Graham Richardson. Welcome to you both. Michael, surely now corporate Australia has got to have learnt its lesson after this, after The Voice. They should just stick to what they know, stick to turning a profit and stop worrying about social issues.
Look, I think they're getting the message. Have they got it completely? No, they haven't. But Woolworths have suffered shockingly in the eyes of the community, Sharri, over the last year. And I think they're getting the message slowly. You know, Mr. Banducci, pack the salads, right? Cut up the carrots and make sure the milk's fresh. Do not lecture people with $2 million worth of shareholders' money about how they should vote for The Voice. Right? Keep the money in the bank, return it to shareholders, pay it in dividends, whatever. Do not lecture us about these things. And of course, Australia Day. Here's an idea, Sharri. Why don't they, when they say, declining interest, why didn't they make a big thing of it? Why didn't they have big stalls at the front, celebrate Australia Day, etc., etc.? No. This has been a very woke corporation. It's gone bad in the last year. The interview was bad enough, but I think the interview is nothing compared to how woke this guy has taken, and the board have taken Woolworths, and they will suffer a consumer backlash, and I think their brand has been seriously damaged in the last 12 months. Yeah,
no, I agree with you. And it's a good business. It operates well. You know, their online shopping services work perfectly. But you know, it comes down to the culture, the corporate culture. Richo, this has got to be a lesson for other companies as well, doesn't it? And perhaps also a lesson not to go on the ABC, because if you ask them to cut something out, they will play it over and over again.
Yeah, look, don't start me on the ABC. That we haven't got time. But I think you know what we've just got to be here is just ordinary common sense tells you which way to go on this stuff. You don't have to, you know, get involved in elaborate plans, elaborate thinking, even deep thinking. You don't need it here. It's pretty simple.
It's also, I think, interesting that CEOs now are expected to be brilliant media performers. This is now part of the job. And if they perform badly in the media, if they handle a crisis badly or seen to be badly in the media, like with Optus, then they pay a heavy price for it. Now let's turn to these comments by Paul Keating today. He did an interview with the Fin Review to mark his 80th birthday. And in it, he spoke about his own age and he compared it to President Biden, who's 81. Paul Keating told the Fin Review that it's no accident people are at their peak in their 40s. You know, certainly I was. And he says that relative infirmity meant that 81-year-old Joe Biden ought to put his queue in the rack rather than seek re-election in November. Graham, you're a baby compared to both Paul Keating and Joe Biden. You're only in your early 70s. What do you think about this suggestion?
75.
I thought you were 74, so there you go, mid-70s. But what do you think about this suggestion that, you know, 80s is too old to run for the presidency?
Well, it is too old to run for the president, but we haven't got much choice, because if we don't get him, we get Trump, who's almost 80. So it's 6 or 1/2 dozen the other in America. I don't know what they're going to do about it. I don't know why they can't find better candidates. When I look at, you know, this massive nation with all the power, all the money, all the intellectual force that they've got, and yet what do you see? Two old bumbling fools. You know, one of them who doesn't know what room he's in, and the other one who's never read a book. It's not a very good look.
What do you think about this, Michael Kroger?
Well, look, let's be very clear about this. Joe Biden is not going to be re-elected, right? If he gets re-elected, he doesn't start his second term until January 2025, and his term finishes in January 2029. That's 5 years away. So the public are not going to vote for him again. Biden is finished. He's not going to be re-elected. There is zero chance of him being re-elected, and I think there's probably, Sharri, only a 10% chance that he'll be the Democratic Party candidate. I can't see him getting to the line. So you've got Gavin Newsom, Michelle Obama. Do not underestimate Kamala Harris. Don't laugh, everybody watching. Kamala Harris, they've got to be pre-selected effectively by the Democratic Convention. The Democratic Convention is extremely left-wing, and Harris's supporters will be saying to her, the only reason your polling numbers are bad is because you're vice president of that silly old fool who can't stand up and doesn't know where he is. That's Kamala, why your numbers are in the toilet. They will be giving her enormous encouragement to run. There are reasons why Michelle Obama won't run. There's reasons why Newsom couldn't get elected. I would think Harris has got as good a chance as being the Democratic candidate as anyone, because she will be saying, why am I standing aside? I haven't done anything wrong with VP, and she'll be convinced that her problem is because she's VP to Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, if Kamala Harris ends up as the candidate, you may as well just keep Joe Biden in there. They're as hopeless as each other for different reasons. Let's turn to these reports today from the Times newspaper in the UK about the death of the Russian opposition leader Navalny. The reports are that he was punched in the heart by KGB operatives after he was effectively frozen. He was exposed to sub-zero temperatures in his Arctic prison. This has come from, so it's the Times newspaper, but they were attributing it to a human rights group, and they said that the bruising on his body was consistent with the one-punch kill technique that's taught to Russian special forces. Graham, look, we know he was murdered. The detail about it still is so shocking, even though it's, we've known about this for a few days now.
Yeah, look, I'm banned from going to Russia. I'm number 127 on Putin's list because I continue to call him a murderous thug. And if you look at what's happened here, he's demonstrated it yet again. He is a murderous thug.
Yeah. Look, we're talking about Donald Trump rambling. Well, he finally responded to Navalny's death or murder today. He had this weird post saying the sudden death of Alexei Navalny has made me more and more aware of what's happening in our country, as in America. It is a slow, steady progression with crooked, radical left politicians, prosecutors and judges leading us down a path to destruction, open the borders, etc., etc. Michael, this is a jumbled response that really seems to blame America for Navalny's death. I mean, where is the mention of Putin and Russia here?
This is the problem with Trump. I mean, he's got the right instincts on a whole lot of issues, right, without going through them all. But on some foreign policy issues, his instincts on NATO are right, by the way. He made a ridiculous comment about Putin invading, but he's right that they should pay their way. But on the Ukraine, he's been shocking. He's got a blind spot about Putin, no matter what he says. This was a ridiculous comment he made. There is no comparison between the murderous KGB regime, which Putin is in charge of, and the American legal system corrupt, so some parts of that are. He has a blind spot about some world leaders. This guy, Putin, is one of them. The North Korean dictator is another. He seems to think the art of the deal, I can pals up to these guys and I'll solve Ukraine within a day, is what he's saying. No, he's incredibly disappointing on some of these issues, and Putin is one of them. His comments are bizarre, Sharri.
Yeah, I agree. And why it matters so much, it's not just a side issue, is this comes to America playing the role as leader of the free world. We need the US president to do that. It needs to hold Russia to account. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, it's part of the axis of evil. We need to know and be clear-eyed about who our enemies are. And, Trump seems to be going down some, crazy obscure right-wing path on this when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Very quickly before we have to go, Richo, Nikki Haley is still sticking in the race. She had this to say today. Have a look.
I feel no need to kiss the ring. I refuse to quit. South Carolina will vote on Saturday. But on Sunday, I'll still be running for president. I'm not going anywhere.
Graham, what's this about? She doesn't seem to have any chance of securing the Republican nomination.
No, she doesn't, which is disappointing in some respects because when I look at her, I think she's all quality. I'm really impressed by her. But she just doesn't have the numbers, as they say. And without them, you don't get too far.
Yeah, as you well know, as a famous numbers man, Richo. Michael Kroger, Graham Richardson, thank you both so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharri.
Now, as we just spoke about, former PM Paul Keating gave an interview today with the Fin Review, but he made these really interesting remarks. He said that income tax rates in Australia are still too high. He said there's an issue that all societies should have of how much a person's conscientious efforts and wealth should be delivered to the state. He said once you start getting the top rate over, in his opinion, 39%, it becomes confiscatory. And when it becomes confiscatory, you just lose all that impetus to make a dollar and do clever things. In other words, anti-aspirational. Well, joining me to discuss, Herald Sun business commentator Terry McCrann, the legend. Terry, what do you think about this? I think these are very sensible comments from Paul Keating. And, like other countries around the world, we should be having the tax thresholds indexed to coincide with inflation. What do you think?
Absolutely, Sharri, and I think the big message out of that statement from Paul that unlike some other 80-year-olds we might have been talking about,
yes.
Paul Keating's still got his marbles. Clearly, too high tax rates are punitive, and they're not only punitive for the taxpayer, but it means less tax revenues actually flow to the government. One of the great lessons we should have learnt in the second half of the 20th century is that lowering the tax rate actually increases the tax harvest, because you get more production, you get more income, you get more taxes. And I thought it was interesting that he chose 39% as the benchmark where this punitive level starts, given that the Albanese government is bringing back a 37-cent tax rate. Now, Paul Keating was talking about the top rate, which, as we know, is nearly 50 cents in the dollar. But that 37-cent tax rate, which is coming back, which the previous government under Stage 3 was removing, that means that a lot of Australians progressively over the years are going to go into that level of paying tax. And it comes back to your point about tax indexation. They'll do so because the brackets won't be indexed. So we get inflation going up, we get wages going up, we get that tax hike going up.
Yeah. Look, it's also interesting that he would make that criticism because Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, is Paul Keating's protege. So it's not direct criticism, of course, but it is because they've just changed the Stage 3 reforms that would have lowered the top tax rate.
Well, it's more that 37 cent, which was going to be abolished and come down to 30 cents. And yes, there would have been a pushing up there would have been a form of tax indexation by pushing up the brackets. It is interesting, but I think that Paul Keating cherishes what he did with the tax system back in the 80s, and he would not be happy with the way things have gone subsequently. I mean, he gave us the reformed tax system, he gave us the reformed industrial relations system, which led to better outcomes for workers and better outcomes for businesses. And I don't think he'd be happy seeing those sorts of reforms being rolled back across the board by the current government, with Tony Burke going off on his own wild frolic in the IR space, and this happening with the tax system.
Yeah, I know that the IR reform is so radical, and it shows that the PM doesn't have control over his ministers, or there's no overarching narrative because they each have autonomy to pursue their own pet projects. And for Tony Burke, it's getting the unions back on side. Terry, the government claimed that they did have positive economic news today. For the first time in 3 years, wages growth outstripped inflation, but only just. So inflation for the year was 4.1%. Wages increased by 4.2%. Look, there's no percentage point here that's too small for the government to celebrate. But Terry, seriously, to what degree can Labor claim responsibility for this wages growth, and is anyone actually even feeling it anyway?
Sharri, you have to think that the champagne corks are popping all around Australia, particularly in the working class suburbs. I mean, It is absurd for the government to really grab at this. Don't mention 2022, when we had inflation of 8.5% and we had wage increases of less than 4%. So no, it is absurd. And in a sense, it would be very silly for the government to claim credit for this, because those wages rising at more than 4% is precisely the biggest threat for homeowners to see their interest rates stay at the very high levels or indeed go up. Michelle Bullock, the Reserve Bank governor, has made it absolutely crystal clear that 4% wage increases and higher is incompatible with getting inflation down unless we have dramatic improvements in productivity. And we've got a government which is so focused on destroying productivity in IR, in energy, all the other parts of the economy. So I really don't think Jim Chalmers would be wise to claim this as some sort of great outcome, because it may be the case that we'll see higher interest rates as a consequence.
We will see. I mean, everyone's predicting something different when it comes to rate cuts this year. Terry McCrann, always wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, Australian foreign affairs officials are actually defending the United Nations organisation that has links to Hamas. You won't believe these comments. And the man who broke open this UNRWA scandal is going to join me live from Geneva. Plus, the Prime Minister scrambles to try and correct the record on whether he plans to head to an early election. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, now to more shocking developments in the UNRWA scandal that we've been talking about on the show. In Senate estimates, a DFAT official has made a series of false assertions about the UN organisation and its links to Hamas. Mark Innes-Brown, he's the first Assistant Secretary at DFAT, said that members of the Gaza Telegram group were not UNRWA staff. Have a look.
Some of these reports, some of the people that are involved in some of the alleged acts are UNRWA employees, but often significant numbers of people are not. And so it sort of gets all a bit blurred.
Not really that blurred at all. As we've reported before, the human rights group United Nations Watch has exposed a Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers in Gaza where there's praise for the Hamas massacre of October 7. Now, Mark Innes-Brown, that Foreign Affairs official, also made a series of disparaging remarks about UN Watch itself.
How long have these types of allegations been raised by advocacy groups about UNRWA?
Off and on for years, Senator. I think it's generally known that there are at least several organisations that their agenda is to focus on misconduct by UNRWA.
He admits they've known about the allegations of misconduct for years, and yet Australia kept pouring millions and millions of dollars into the organisation. He saw that as evidence that there was something wrong with UN Watch instead of something wrong with his own department. Yet here was Foreign Minister Penny Wong defending her decision to send Australian taxpayer funds to UNRWA after numerous warnings of their links to Hamas over the years.
There is not another organisation which can provide humanitarian assistance on the ground in the way UNRWA does. So, truth number one. We have spoken to the Israelis and we have asked for further evidence, but I think it is clear from UNRWA's own actions that they regard these allegations as serious.
So she says the allegations are serious, but apparently not serious enough to actually ask the head of UNRWA about them when she spoke to him directly.
We have asked the Israelis for it.
But you spoke to the head of UNRWA.
Well,
he
hang
hasn't.
on. He may. I don't know what he has. What he and I discussed, what he and I have discussed was the two processes that he's undertaken, and we will stay in close contact with UNRWA about those processes.
She admitted there that she hadn't raised it with him. Let's bring in now Hillel Newer, the Executive Director of United Nations Watch. The organisation's based in Geneva, but Hillel comes to us this evening from Tel Aviv. Well, it's morning where you are, Hillel. Thank you so much for joining me once again. Look, I want to talk to you about what happened in our Australian Senate. Instead of wanting to deal with information of the terror links at UNRWA, that DFAT official that you would have just heard chose to attack you and your organisation. What's your response to this?
Look, we're a human rights organisation that has worked closely with Australia's representatives. I worked with Mike Smith 20 years ago when he was Australian ambassador, chair of the Human Rights Commission, and since then for many years at our human rights conferences that we hold with dissidents. So we're known to the Australian Foreign Ministry for the work we do promoting human rights. One of the things we do is exposing genocidal anti-Semitism incited by UNRWA staff systematically. Not a few bad apples, hundreds that we saw on Facebook. We've reported it. This gentleman, Mark Innes-Brown, who, by the way, is the former Australian ambassador in Tehran, he accused our organization of, quote, having an agenda. He said there are significant exaggerations. That's the character of these reports. He told lies about our report. I'm holding it in my hand. It's the report that I presented on January 30th in a major joint hearing of the US Congress, where we exposed a Telegram group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers. He said they're not teachers. If you look at the admins on page 20 of this report, you will see 8 names of UNRWA teachers and other employees with their contract numbers. They are the admins of this group. In this report, it's on our website, unwatch.org. It is replete with UNRWA internal staff memos, UNRWA names of teachers, their details of their salaries. It's absurd for him to contest the facts. He's trying to disparage us. He told the Australian Senate that they're taking the allegation seriously. It's a total lie. All they're seeking to do is to disparage us. and avoid accountability for the fact that they gave tens of millions of dollars of Australian taxpayer money to fund a group that is complicit with Hamas.
In fact, $200 million from the Australian government has gone to UNRWA since 2010. That report coming from the Adelaide Advertiser. But Hillel, you know, there seems to be a common theme. I've seen other UN officials attack you and your organisation for tarnishing the reputation of UNRWA instead of actually examining the employees that took part on October 7. I mean, it's absurd. And then you've got our Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, who spoke to the head of UNRWA but didn't ask questions about these allegations or where Australian taxpayer dollars, hardworking taxpayer dollars, are actually going. I mean, this is farcical.
Look, Sharri, what we're seeing with UNRWA, the revelations just a week or two ago that a terror tunnel of Hamas with a key asset, computer servers, was located directly beneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, and their chief, Philippe Lazzarini, said literally on Twitter, UNRWA has no way of knowing what's beneath its headquarters. Really? They don't know what's below their nose. They had no idea, even as the parking lot 10 years ago was sinking. They knew this see no evil, hear no evil. That's the approach of UNRWA with Hamas. Sadly, Sharri, it seems like your foreign minister, Penny Wong, has the same approach with UNRWA. Her official, Mark Innes-Brown, said, well, we take these up with UNRWA. Well, UNRWA is riddled with Hamas members. So when they say, this teacher doesn't work for us anymore, or he didn't work with us when he encouraged terrorism, when he praised Adolf Hitler, that is not serious. The Australian Foreign Ministry, DFAT, never contacted us once. For 10 years, we've been submitting warnings about thousands of UNRWA staff who encourage and promote terrorism. The Australian Foreign Ministry says they take it very seriously. They didn't contact us once. They contact UNRWA. UNRWA gives them a bogus reply, and they say, you know, check, their investigation is done. It's not serious. And in my opinion, Mark Innes-Brown is in contempt of the Australian Senate, and I'll be submitting a letter to the Australian Senate today to document the lies and misrepresentations that he made to the Senate.
Asking for a correction there. That's big news, Hillel Nua. I mean, he says you have an agenda. Yeah, you've got an agenda to stop taxpayer funds being used or being exploited for terrorism. And what a shocking agenda that is. Now, just before you go, Hillel, I want to ask you about this UN Security Council resolution that the US eventually vetoed just today. That resolution was going to demand a ceasefire of Israel. Look, are you concerned? The US left it quite late before they actually decided to veto this. So are you concerned that under Joe Biden, there may not be a strong defence of Israel in the future? Are you concerned that under Biden, US may be wavering in its commitment to Israel?
Look, there's no question that right after the October 7th massacre, President Biden couldn't have been more clear. He spoke about pure, unadulterated evil that Hamas perpetrated on innocent women, children, babies, elderly, abductions, massacre, mutilation, torture, and rape. But since then, Sharri, and in recent days, I'm sorry to see the United States appears to be wavering and not letting Israel remove this threat. Hamas has said clearly they want to repeat the massacres. Would America cease fire when they're marching on Berlin and about to destroy Hitler, when they were about to destroy Japan after they attacked Pearl Harbor, or Al-Qaeda after they attacked 9/11? The terrorist infrastructure is still in place. Israel should be allowed to defeat the terrorists, and the Western world, the free world, should not stand in the way and keep Hamas in power. That would be a grave mistake and damaging not only for Israel, but for all of us worldwide who are threatened by radical Islamic terrorism.
Absolutely. Completely agree with you, Hillel Nua. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay safe over there in Tel Aviv.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, the embarrassing job ads that show that the Labor government is now hiring for Nauru. Does this mean they're expecting an influx of boats? Plus, my political panel will discuss why Albanese has brought in a Rudd government fixer to Albo's office. So don't miss that. That's after the break. Welcome back. Well, there's reports today that there's an urgent hiring spree for Nauru Detention Centre after a boatload, or potentially 2 boatloads, of migrants landed in WA. Job ads have been placed for an accommodation manager and multiple welfare and security officers. This is perhaps starting to feel like 2010 all over again, when it was at the start of the Rudd and Gillard governments struggling to stem the tide of boat arrivals. And now it's Anthony Albanese, who insists his government shouldn't be held to account for the dozens of asylum seekers who arrived over the weekend, saying it's an unfortunate event, but not his fault. And he claims, and Peter Dutton disagrees, that Operation Sovereign Borders is still in place. Have a look at what the Prime Minister had to say.
We need to make sure that we send a strong message that people who come in an unauthorised fashion won't be settled in Australia, and that is what we have done. Operation Sovereign Borders is in place. It is important that we're able to have regular migration. We want to see an increase in the number of refugees who are taken by Australia.
All right, let's bring in now our Wednesday night political panel. National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP for Fraser, Daniel Molino. Welcome to you both. Daniel, these job ads, do they indicate that Labor's expecting an influx of asylum seekers? The job ads for Nauru Detention Centre, I should say.
Well, hi, Sharri, and thanks for having me on, and hi, Bridget. Look, no, and I think I take a step back here, and I think for me the key thing is that the government is committed to the elements of Operation Sovereign Borders that both parties went to the last election with. And not just that, in our budgets that we've put in place to date, we've increased funding for that by almost $500 million, by $470 million over the forward estimate. So there's really no policy gap between the parties, but you wouldn't know that from the way the Leader of the Opposition is, frankly, in a way that's highly irresponsible, going around and almost being a cheer squad for the people smugglers. It's really not a very edifying way for him to deal with this very important issue.
Bridget, there has been this claim from Labor that Peter Dutton, in highlighting the flaws in the government's national security approach, is a pull factor in asylum seekers and people smugglers. What do you think about that?
Well, what I do know is what is incredibly unfortunate is that this government's approach to border security is failing. We've seen boats arrive. We've seen them being caught short now. Staffing arrivals, they've made changes to temporary protection visas. And all of this is a signal to people smugglers, irrespective of what Peter Dutton and the opposition say. You know, those boats were on their way before we were criticising the government's approach. And let's remember, these are the jokers that last time they were in government, we saw 50,000 illegal arrivals, over 800 boats and 1,200 people die at sea. And I just think Australians need to be very, very cautious about anything this government says on border security, because they clearly don't have a plan.
Look, the Prime Minister today insisted that he will see out the full term in government. There was a leaked memo revealed by Sam Maiden at news.com. The memo was from Albanese's Chief of Staff, Tim Gartrell, where he used language that referred to this as an election year. The Prime Minister says it's a complete beat-up. Daniel, has the Prime Minister reassured Labor members of caucus that he does plan to serve a full term and only head to the polls next year?
Well, Sharri, I had a look at that memo, and the way I read it was that it basically said something along the lines that there'll be an election at some point within roughly the next 12 months, which is kind of what we all knew anyway. So, look, I didn't read it as being anything particularly new. And look, I think the PM went out just to clarify things today and made it clear that he fully intends to serve out the term and intends to hand down a couple of budgets, which you know, I think is welcome. So I didn't see anything new in that, the way I read it.
Look, I actually think the more interesting thing about that memo is, you know, and I agree the language could be taken either way. He did say, as we enter an election year, It doesn't necessarily mean the election will be this year, although it could be. But I think the more interesting thing about the memo is that it was announcing the return of David Epstein, who was a key figure in the Rudd government. The fact that Albanese is revamping his office in such a major way at the top, we've got Fiona Sugden, who was also a senior media advisor for Rudd and Gillard. We've got The Guardian journalist Catherine Murphy, who's come in, and now David Epstein. Bridget, this has got to indicate that Albanese is concerned about how his office has been operating. It can't be anything else.
No, it can't be anything else other than getting geared up for a campaign and making sure your office and all the comms that are coming out of PMO are match fit for an election year, as his Chief of Staff outlined in the memo. I think the Prime Minister will go when it is politically expedient for him to win the next election. And I think he can make all the weasel words he likes heading into this year. He will go when he thinks he has the best chance of winning. And he has started off the year making sure that he's not ruling out going out towards the end of this year. So I think we need to be prepared for an election going forward. He's also tried to say he wants 4-year terms. Well, I don't think after the first 2 years Australians want to wait 4 years for more damage to be done by this government and the chance to vote them out.
Look, he has said pretty strongly that we're not going to the polls this year, but maybe we shouldn't all be getting an arm tattoo on that point just yet, because we have had other broken promises just recently. Now, you would have seen this story, or you might have heard about it, that the federal government has issued new dietary advice related to climate change. Well, now farmers have today come out saying that they're concerned about this advice, that it could fuel an ideological war on red meat. The new guidelines include the climate impact of various foods, and there's concerns from some that consumers could be advised to reduce their red meat intake to help reduce emissions. Daniel Molino, are you going to be following your own government's climate food advice and turn vegan?
Well, I was hoping you'd start with me, Sharri, because I was going to preface my answer by saying that I'm definitely a carnivore, and I must say in a household which has welcomed an 8-week-old dog in late November who's grown from 4.5 to 21 kilograms in about 16 weeks. That wasn't all on vegetable leaves.
Wow.
So can I just say that...
That is an expensive dog with a lot of meat eating.
Oh, but it's well worth it. Look, I think this is a bit of a storm in the teacup, I think. I saw the Australian story, and this is a consultation process that I understand started under the previous government. And look, I think it's a pretty wide-ranging consultation process, and it's looking at a whole range of issues and what information should go to consumers. And look, I'm very confident that I'll be enjoying a good steak both before and after the release of these guidelines. I mean, my general principle is that more information's better so long as you don't overload consumers. And let's let this process play out before we jump at too many shadows, I think.
Bridget, I mean, are we going to see kind of warnings like we do in cigarette packages, but on chicken and meat in the supermarket for climate change?
Yeah, absolutely, Sharri. I mean, Daniel talks about information. Well, to make sure it's factual. I mean, the fact is human beings didn't get to where we are on the pyramid by not eating a hell of a lot of red meat protein. And our farmers are so sustainable in how they produce that. And for us to be teaching young people, nutrition guidelines are taught in schools, so no matter what is done in the Molino home, his kids are going to be taught that it is less sustainable, it is worse for the environment for children to be eating red meat. And without taking into account how that livestock production is occurring, you're actually missing out on a whole lot of environmental benefits, such as the soil carbon sequestration. I don't think we can save the planet by starving it, and this is exactly the type of ideological wokeness that we don't need to be seeing part of public policy, because it actually impacts people's livelihoods, and that being our primary producers and the supply chains that they rely on.
All right, Bridget McKenzie, Daniel Molino, great to have you both on this evening. Thank you. Now, after the break, we'll speak to the victim of that anti-Semitic harassment in Melbourne. They will join me live. This is the footage Andrew Bolt played you earlier. Stay tuned. That's coming up after the break. Well, more than 100 pro-Palestinian protesters gathered outside a Melbourne City Council meeting last night. They were waiting to see if the councillors would vote for a motion calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but they didn't. Deputy Lord Mayor Nicholas Rees, and you know him well from Paul Murray's show, well, he had the deciding vote and voted it down. This decision sparked anger from those outside, and that anger then manifested in the harassment of Jews nearby. Here is what we're about to show you right now, exclusive footage of a 60-year-old Jewish man being pushed over by Palestinian protesters simply for wearing a kippah. Have a look.
And continue to commit this genocide against the Palestinians of Gaza using Australian weapons, as reported by Al Jazeera in November last year.
It's disgraceful. Yet on 3AW this morning, the president of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network said that there was no violence at all. Nothing to see here. Have a listen.
They were deliberately antagonistic and provocative and went up to the crew with an Israeli flag.
Well, for the truth, let's actually speak to the man in the video who was there that night and who was abused, Yaakov, and we're not going to say your surname to protect you for security reasons. Yaakov, thank you so much for joining me. So what happened last night? Were you antagonistic, as Nasser Mashni says?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. That was the biggest lie. This is another one that he can heap onto his big baggage full of lies. We were not antagonistic at all. No one was there looking for a fight. As you saw at the beginning, I'm walking through holding a can of Coke in my hand. Is that the kind of sign of somebody who's looking for a fight? My hands were by my side. My head was down. I didn't even put my hands up in the beginning when they came up to us and blocked our rite of passage to the entrance of the City Hall where we had tickets to.
So you had tickets to go to City Hall?
We did.
And then we saw on the footage that Andrew played earlier, we just don't have time to play it right now, that you were the ones, you were pushed to the ground, you were shoved, and yet you were the ones actually moved on by police, not the violent protesters. What did police say to you? And did you tell them that you had tickets to the function, to the City Town Hall?
Well, let's look at this at the way that it has to be seen. I represent a group called the Unsilent Majority, and we represent the silent majority of not just Jews, but Australians in general who are sick of all of this happening in our beautiful country and our beautiful city of Melbourne. And what's been happening here has not just started today. It's not even started on October the 7th. It started way before even COVID. And now the cops are pretty much taking the easy hand because they're too scared to actually come out and do their jobs. And I'm not talking about the cops on the ground, I'm talking about the commissioner and all the higher-ups that just do not have the guts to do what needs to be done, which is to deal with the people who are actually antagonizing, the people who are starting all these fights, the people who are causing all these riots and disruptions to business and everyday lives.
Now, very quickly,
we showed the police that we had tickets.
And you've made a police...
We showed them we had tickets, they saw it.
You've made a complaint to police today, is that right?
I did. I told them exactly what they already have on their body cams, which is that we were not looking for a fight. We went there. We got to the corner. We asked the police that were standing there the directions to go to find the entrance, and they literally pointed us to what looked like to us from our viewpoint in the middle of the crowd. From where we were, all we saw was over 200 of them blocking the entrance. So we said, OK, we'll quietly walk through and go in to the public arena.
Look, so sorry that happened to you last night. Thank you very much for joining me now. We're out of time. Thank you very much for your company. I'll see you tomorrow at 8, and here's Paul Murray.